Iran calls it, in its own military terminology, the Mosquito Fleet. Small, fast, relatively cheap boats armed with anti-ship missiles, rocket launchers, and limpet mines, built for one specific purpose: to swarm a much larger warship from every direction at once, and to overwhelm it through sheer coordinated numbers rather than through raw individual firepower. This is not a slogan invented for a headline. It is a real, documented tactic, tracked for years by the naval analysts who cover this specific region. And over the course of this war, it has become genuinely central to how Iran is trying to contest American control of the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past 2 weeks specifically, two things happened that sit at the heart of this story. The United States struck more than 60 of those boats in a single confirmed military operation. And then, separately, it answered Iran's Mosquito Fleet with something that fleet has never once had to face in its entire operational history: a coordinated attack carried out by American autonomous drone boats operating with not a single sailor aboard any of them. Welcome back to Alex on World Affairs. Today we are laying out exactly what is confirmed about both sides of that exchange, plainly, with the specific dates and the named sources behind every individual claim. And just as importantly, we are going to be honest about what still genuinely is not confirmed, despite how confidently some of it is circulating online right now. A short note on method before we get into the details, because a story with this many competing claims from this many different governments genuinely needs it stated plainly and upfront, rather than discovered halfway through. Every figure in this video is sourced to a named outlet or an official statement: U.S. Central Command, the defense trade publications Naval Today and Homeland Security Today, Axios reporting carried by Business Today, the Financial Times reporting on Iran's boat fleet as carried by Middle East Eye, and Iran's own Press TV, which will be identified explicitly every single time its account differs from the American one, rather than quietly blended in as though both sides agree. Some of the numbers currently circulating about this story, specific vessel counts attributed to unnamed satellite passes, have not been independently verified through any of those channels, and this breakdown will not repeat them as settled fact simply because they happen to sound precise or dramatic. If that kind of discipline is what you want from your coverage of this war, that's worth a like right now, because it's genuinely the difference between understanding this conflict as it develops and just reacting to whichever clip from it happens to reach you first. Let's start with what the Mosquito Fleet actually is, precisely, because understanding it fully explains almost everything else that follows. Iran's Navy, as a matter of basic fact, is not built to fight the United States Navy ship for ship. It cannot. And Iran's own planners know that. What Iran has instead is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, a separate paramilitary maritime force distinct from Iran's conventional navy, operating hundreds of small, fast attack craft distributed across bases all along the Persian Gulf coast. The tactic itself is straightforward on paper and genuinely difficult to counter in practice. You send a dozen or more of these boats at a single target, simultaneously, from multiple different bearings. And you do that specifically so that a warship's defensive systems, which are built primarily to track and intercept missiles and aircraft, get saturated. They get overwhelmed trying to prioritize which small, fast-moving contact is the actual threat, and which is a decoy or a distraction. The Financial Times, in reporting carried by Middle East Eye, described this network as a central, load-bearing pillar of Iran's entire strategy for confronting the United States in the Gulf. And the reason is exactly that logic. It lets a comparatively weak conventional navy pressure commercial shipping and threaten a far stronger opponent during precisely the kind of high-tension standoff this war has become. Now, this is not a pattern that emerged only with the current war. And understanding that longer history helps explain why American forces treat every close approach by one of these boats so seriously. Naval Forces Central Command has documented individual, so-called unsafe and unprofessional encounters between IRGC vessels and American ships for years, long before this current conflict ever began. In one widely documented incident from 2022, an Iranian patrol boat approached the American coastal patrol ship USS Sirocco head-on at high speed, closing to within 50 yards before the Sirocco issued repeated audible warnings and then deployed a warning flare. That single encounter lasted roughly a full hour before the Iranian vessel finally withdrew. In a separate incident that same year, an IRGC boat shined a spotlight directly at the bridge of a U.S. destroyer at night and crossed within 150 yards of American ships, close enough that Navy officials described it plainly as dangerously close under any circumstances, day or night. Individually, encounters like these are minor, but together they established a documented pattern. They are exactly the kind of harassment tactic that Iran's larger swarm doctrine is built on, just at a smaller scale, testing how close a single boat can get before it triggers an American response. And that is precisely the same calculation, simply multiplied across dozens of boats, when the tactic is finally used as an actual wartime swarm rather than a peacetime provocation. That accumulated history is a large part of why American commanders treat every reported approach with real caution, rather than dismissing it, because a pattern documented over multiple years, across multiple administrations and multiple individual commanding officers, tends to carry far more institutional weight than any single incident could on its own. Here is where that fleet finally met American firepower directly, with specific sourced dates. On July 7th, according to reporting from the naval trade publication Naval Today, U.S. Central Command carried out a wave of retaliatory strikes, hitting more than 80 locations in and around the Strait of Hormuz. And of those, more than 60 targets were specifically identified as Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats. CENTCOM's own statement, cited in that same reporting, said the strikes used precision-guided munitions in direct response to Iranian attacks on commercial vessels transiting the strait, and that they were intended to reduce Iran's capacity to threaten shipping and to disrupt freedom of navigation through the corridor. A separate defense outlet, Homeland Security Today, corroborated that same operation independently, describing it as hitting coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 IRGC small boats in a single coordinated wave. And that same outlet reported that the ceasefire framework established under a June memorandum had, by that point, functionally collapsed under the weight of exactly this kind of exchange. That July 7th strike did not happen in a vacuum. It came one day after Iranian forces struck two laden tankers running without visible tracking on an approved outbound route, including a Marshall Islands-flagged Qatari LNG carrier and a Saudi-owned ultra-large crude carrier. According to that same Homeland Security Today reporting, which tracks maritime risk specifically for the shipping industry, that tanker strike marked, by that outlet's own count, the third confirmed Iranian attack on Qatari LNG assets during 2026 alone. It followed an earlier hit in March and the forced turning back of two separate LNG carriers under IRGC pressure in April. So this was a pattern stretching back months, not a single isolated incident. The immediate commercial impact was real. 6 vessels rerouted away from the strait's southern corridor. One LNG tanker, carrying roughly 900,000 barrels of cargo, halted its transit entirely and anchored mid-strait rather than continue, a decision that, on its own, represents a significant loss measured in delivery penalties and idle charter costs, even before you account for any physical damage. Maritime risk trackers assessed the overall environment across the strait, the Gulf of Oman, and the northern Arabian Gulf as critical at that point. And that is the trigger for what followed. More than 60 of Iran's small boats destroyed within about 24 hours of that tanker attack. The pattern continued less than a week later. According to Axios reporting carried by Business Today, on July 13th, American forces struck Iranian missile systems, air defense sites, and IRGC speedboats at several additional locations around the strait, described by CENTCOM as an effort to further reduce Iran's capability to threaten commercial shipping under direct presidential order. CENTCOM separately pushed back, directly and firmly, on Iranian claims that Iran controlled the strait, stating plainly that Iran does not control the strait and that traffic was flowing normally, while acknowledging what it called ongoing Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations. President Trump, speaking to Reuters by phone during that same window, was characteristically blunt about it, saying simply that American forces were, in his words, beating them up. Iran's retaliation for that round extended well beyond the strait itself. It spread across 4 separate countries in a single coordinated response. The IRGC claimed strikes on command and control facilities and drone hangars in Jordan, a radar installation and missile launcher systems in Kuwait, refueling platforms in Oman, and a jet maintenance center in Qatar. Kuwait's defense ministry, in its own separate official statement, described what it called a criminal attack that damaged 3 northern border posts and an offshore oil drilling platform, wounding 1 worker. Language notably harsher than Kuwait's typically measured public statements on regional conflicts it isn't directly party to. Now to the American side's most significant answer in this specific fight, because it represents something that has never happened before in the history of American naval warfare, not just in this war, but ever. On July 12, CENTCOM confirmed that 3 autonomous surface vessels, unmanned boats operating without a single crew member aboard, carried out a coordinated strike on Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base. Reporting from Interesting Engineering, drawing on CENTCOM's own released footage, described each 24-foot composite hull vessel approaching the target from a different direction, operating fully autonomously, converging near a Ghadir-class Iranian submarine docked at a maintenance facility, and then detonating. CENTCOM itself described the operation as the first time American forces have ever employed sea drones in offensive combat. And Interesting Engineering's reporting noted that this marks the first known instance of any major world navy conducting an offensive mission using autonomous attack boats, rather than purely defensive or surveillance ones. And there is a specific irony in that operation that is worth naming directly, because it goes to the very heart of why this exchange matters more than a single strike count. Iran's navy has spent years building its reputation and its actual doctrine around swarm attacks, sending numerous small, fast, cheap boats at one larger, more expensive target to overwhelm it. The Bandar Abbas operation used a structurally similar idea: several small, fast, relatively inexpensive vessels converging on one target, but it inverted it entirely. Instead of Iran's Mosquito Fleet swarming an American warship on the open water, American autonomous boats swarmed into a defended Iranian harbor and struck a fixed target from the inside. Iran's own signature tactic, turned back against Iran. It's worth knowing more about the vessels themselves, because the technical details explain why the Navy chose this platform for exactly this kind of mission. The boats were built by a company called Saronic. Each one carries a stealth-oriented hull design, along with onboard artificial intelligence for navigation and targeting. And the unit that operates them, Task Force 59, was originally stood up specifically to test unmanned maritime systems for surveillance and reconnaissance work, not for direct combat. That same reporting noted that Task Force 59 had, just weeks earlier in June, carried out what the US military described as the world's first autonomous combat search and rescue mission, using a similar unmanned vessel to help recover American personnel. So the Bandar Abbas strike marked that same unit's shift, from a purely supporting role into direct offensive combat, inside the span of about 1 month. The specific vessel, which Saronic calls the Corsair, measures roughly 24 feet, built with a composite hull designed to reduce its radar signature and engineered to operate without a human crew for extended periods, using onboard autonomous navigation combined with a modular payload bay, so the same basic hull can be reconfigured for different missions. Surveillance 1 week, strike the next, without requiring an entirely different boat. And Saronic reportedly moved that platform from prototype into a full Navy production contract, worth up to several $100 million, in a matter of months rather than years, and has already produced several hundred units as part of scaling toward a genuine operational fleet. That detail matters because it tells you the Bandar Abbas strike was not an isolated experiment. It was the first combat use of a system the Navy had already committed to producing at real scale, well before this specific mission happened. That is a materially different story than a rushed, improvised response thrown together once the war made the need for it obvious. Quick pause here. If the technical side of how autonomous weapons are actually being used in a live war is the kind of thing you want more of, tell me in the comments, and be specific about which angle interests you most. The drone boats themselves and how they're built, the swarm doctrine Iran spent years developing on the other side of this exchange, or the broader pattern of this ceasefire collapsing and reforming multiple times this year. There is far more verified detail on each of those threads than fits in a single video, and I'd genuinely rather go deep on whichever one you actually want explained properly next. Now, it's worth being precise about what CENTCOM's own strikes actually claim to have accomplished, because Iran disputes a meaningful part of that account directly, and both sides deserve to be presented accurately, rather than having one narrative simply overwrite the other. CENTCOM's public position, reiterated in a statement carried on July 12th, is that the Strait of Hormuz remains open to all vessels seeking lawful transit, that Iran does not control the strait, and that more than 140 vessels had passed through it in the preceding 7 days, despite what CENTCOM called unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations. That statement was issued specifically in response to Iranian claims that the IRGC had fired warning shots at a vessel attempting to transit along what Iran considered an unauthorized route, a claim CENTCOM was directly and explicitly pushing back against, rather than simply ignoring. Iran's own state broadcaster tells a very different story about its naval capability, and it's worth hearing that account in full before weighing it. According to Iran's press TV, the IRGC Navy has said American claims that Iran's naval capabilities, infrastructure, vessels, and assets have been completely destroyed since the war's outbreak in late February are simply false. Iranian authorities maintain that their naval forces remain fully operational and continue actively patrolling regional waterways, including the strait itself, unbroken by months of American strikes. That same press TV report describes the IRGC Navy warning that American naval units are under, in its words, full Iranian watch, and nearing what it called 0 hour for a potential Iranian operation, language deliberately chosen to suggest an imminent, coordinated response, rather than the diffuse, ongoing retaliation Iran has actually carried out so far. The same report includes a separate claim that IRGC forces struck and disabled 2 tankers it described as, quote, rogue vessels, that had been misled by American provocations into crossing mined waters, a framing that notably shifts blame for any tanker damage onto American deception, rather than an Iranian decision to attack. I want to be direct about how to weigh that entire set of claims together. It comes exclusively from Iranian state media. It has not been corroborated by CENTCOM or by independent shipping trackers in the reporting available for this breakdown. And state broadcasters in any country have an obvious structural incentive to project strength and continued capability regardless of the actual battlefield picture, particularly for a domestic audience being asked to accept months of continued sacrifice. So it is presented here as Iran's stated position, not as an independently confirmed event. And that distinction should stay attached to it every single time this claim comes up, no matter how confidently it's repeated elsewhere online. This is also the right moment to address the broader claim behind this story's own premise, directly and honestly. Because responsible coverage means correcting an inflated headline just as readily as it reports a real one. Specific figures describing hundreds of Iranian speedboats detected simultaneously through a particular satellite pass have been circulating in some corners of this story's coverage. That precise claim was not independently verifiable, not through CENTCOM's own statements, not through Naval Today's or Homeland Security Today's reporting on the actual strikes, and not through any other named outlet consulted for this breakdown. What is independently confirmed, repeatedly, across multiple separate sources, is this. Iran operates a genuinely large, distributed fleet of small attack boats as a matter of long-standing, well-documented doctrine. American forces destroyed more than 60 of them in a single confirmed operation on July 7th, and additional strikes on IRGC speedboats followed less than a week later, on July 13th. But whether one single formation, numbering in the hundreds, was detected on any specific morning is not something this breakdown can confirm one way or the other. And rather than repeat an unverified number because it sounds more dramatic, the honest version of this story is the one built entirely on what CENTCOM, Iran's own state media, and the independent defense press have actually confirmed on the record. That approach makes for a less explosive opening claim than a headline promising hundreds of boats detected in real time. But it's the version that will still hold up if you go back and check it against the primary sources months from now, which is ultimately a better trade than a bigger number that doesn't survive that same scrutiny. And that distinction matters for a reason beyond simple accuracy. Iran's swarm boat doctrine works, as a psychological and a tactical matter, partly because of uncertainty about scale. A defending force that cannot be entirely sure whether it's facing a dozen boats or several hundred has to prepare very differently than one working from a confirmed, bounded number. It has to dedicate more radar attention, more interceptor readiness, and more overall caution to a threat whose true size remains genuinely unclear at the exact moment a decision has to be made. Some of the most dramatic-sounding figures attached to this story may reflect that very fog of war working exactly as intended, rather than a precisely confirmed intelligence assessment. which is one more reason to hold unverified counts at arm's length. And it's worth adding that inflated numbers can serve a purpose on the reporting side too, entirely separate from any deliberate deception. A single grainy satellite image of a cluster of small vessels can be genuinely difficult to count precisely, even for trained analysts, and the temptation to round an uncertain estimate up to a cleaner, more dramatic figure exists in the coverage just as much as it does on the battlefield. Let's put the full exchange in context, because both halves of this story, Iran's boats and America's drones, sit inside the same larger collapse of this year's ceasefire, rather than existing as a standalone maritime skirmish. A 14-point memorandum, brokered with Pakistani involvement and signed on June 17th, was intended to end major hostilities and open a 60-day window for broader negotiations, including specific commitments from Iran to facilitate safe commercial passage through the strait, commitments both governments now interpret very differently in hindsight. President Trump has since publicly declared that agreement over, following the tanker strikes and the collapse of the diplomatic track that produced it, a track that had itself followed an earlier ceasefire and an earlier naval blockade running from mid-April into late May. Which means this is, at minimum, the third distinct cycle of fighting, pause, and renewed fighting that this single war has gone through inside one calendar year. The economic backdrop makes clear why both sides are fighting this hard over small boats and a narrow strait specifically. Before this conflict, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas moved through the Strait of Hormuz. Tracking of this crisis documents that tanker traffic through the strait dropped by roughly 70% at points during the fighting, with more than 150 ships choosing to anchor outside the strait entirely rather than risk transit. And the confirmed losses across the broader campaign to date include 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, 2 merchant ships captured, and 12 seafarers killed or missing. Every one of Iran's small boats, and every one of America's strikes against them, is functionally a fight over control of that single choke point, and over the enormous flow of global energy trade running through it. And behind every one of those numbers sits an actual commercial crew, most of them with no connection to either government fighting this war, simply trying to move cargo through a waterway that happens to sit at the center of it. 12 seafarers killed or missing is a small number set against the scale of a war involving multiple governments and hundreds of military vessels. But it represents 12 individual people who went to work on an ordinary shipping contract and did not come home. And that fact does not disappear just because it sits inside a larger strategic story about swarm tactics and autonomous drone boats. The same is true for the port worker wounded on that Kuwaiti drilling platform, and for every crew member aboard a tanker that chose to anchor outside the strait rather than risk the transit its cargo was contracted to make, sitting idle for weeks on a paycheck that was never designed to account for a war zone. So what does this specific exchange, swarm boats against autonomous drone boats, actually tell you about where this fight goes next? It tells you that Iran's asymmetric naval doctrine remains its primary tool for contesting a war it cannot win through conventional naval strength, and that this doctrine has now been degraded, specifically and repeatedly, with more than 60 boats destroyed in a single confirmed operation, and additional vessels struck less than a week later. It also tells you that the United States is actively field testing a fundamentally new category of naval capability inside this exact conflict: autonomous, crew-free vessels capable of penetrating a defended harbor and striking a fixed target without risking a single American sailor, expanding from a surveillance and rescue role into direct offensive combat within roughly a single month. Whether Iran's remaining small boat capacity after these confirmed losses can still mount the kind of coordinated swarm its doctrine depends on is a genuinely open question that neither side's public statements resolve. CENTCOM's position is that the strait remains open and Iran's threat has been substantially degraded. Iran's position, through its own state media, is that its naval forces remain fully intact. Independent verification sits somewhere between those two accounts, closer to the American side, given the specific named strike figures involved, but without full visibility into Iran's actual remaining inventory of boats distributed across its coastline. And there is a dimension to this that reaches well beyond the current war with Iran specifically, one that naval planners elsewhere are almost certainly watching closely. The swarm doctrine, built around cheap, expendable, numerous small craft, is not unique to Iran. Comparable thinking shapes how other navies and how larger powers, contemplating contested waters far from the Persian Gulf, approach the same basic problem of pressuring a materially stronger opponent without matching it ship for ship. An American answer that proved effective against exactly that doctrine, using similarly cheap, expendable autonomous vessels rather than expensive crewed warships, would represent a genuinely exportable lesson for American naval strategy far beyond this one conflict. Which is part of why this exchange is being studied as closely by defense analysts as it is by anyone following the daily news cycle. One final point on how to actually read updates on this story going forward, because it will keep developing, and the same discipline applied here should apply to whatever comes next. Watch specifically for confirmed strike figures from CENTCOM or from corroborating defense trade press, rather than round, dramatic-sounding numbers attached to unnamed satellite imagery that no named outlet has verified. Watch for whether Task Force 59's autonomous vessels get used again in an offensive role, because a second confirmed use would indicate this has become a standing part of the American approach to this war, rather than a single demonstration meant mainly for its psychological and diplomatic effect. Watch for whether Iran's own state media escalates its claims about naval strength specifically in response to confirmed American strikes, because that pattern, claiming full operational capability immediately after a documented loss, has now shown up at least once already, and is worth recognizing if it recurs. And watch above all for independent shipping data on whether tanker traffic through the strait actually recovers or continues to decline, because that number, more than any single claim from either government, will tell you which side is genuinely winning the fight for control of this waterway, regardless of which press release sounds more confident. Because confidence in a statement and accuracy in a statement are never quite the same thing in a war being fought this publicly on both sides. Thank you for sitting with the full sourced picture, instead of a single dramatic figure pulled from an unnamed source and repeated without question. This has been a complete breakdown of what is actually confirmed, and just as importantly, of what genuinely is not in the fight over the Strait of Hormuz this week. If updates built this way, sourced, dated, with Iranian and American claims kept clearly separated rather than blended into one narrative, are useful to you, subscribing is the most direct way to make sure the next confirmed development reaches you before an exaggerated version of it reaches you somewhere else. This war's naval dimension is moving into genuinely new territory, and it deserves to be followed with real care. I'll see you in the next one.